it does show that there is perhaps a bit of a plateau and a ceiling, to mix my metaphors, on Reform's ambitions. I still think they'll do well in May. I still think they'll pick up lots of seats in the Midlands, outer boroughs of London. I still think that it's not a disaster for them by any means, but I do think that maybe some of the euphoria or has slightly gone out in terms of it's going to be a long journey, and the end point is not necessarily number 10.
Now let's get up to the minute analysis on all our key political stories, domestic and international. Josh Glancy joins me, associate editor and political columnist for the Sunday Times. Just reacting to that, Josh, first. Domestically, there was some reserve, wasn't there, within the government about this, what has just transpired?
Within our government, yes. Yeah. I mean, I think there are broadly two camps within the UK government on this. There's a kind of a more hawkish camp who do want to see the Iranian regime toppled, and while the UK may not be directly involved, they certainly support what the Americans and Israelis are doing. And then there is a more diplomatic camp, you might say, who are perhaps more wedded to the various nuclear deals that have been on the table or signed at various times over the years, and would have preferred to see a negotiated settlement with the Iranians. So I don't think our sort of system is quite in agreement with itself on this.
No, and we refused the right of the Americans to use various bases in order to carry out some of these attacks, which I guess won't play terribly well with the Trump administration.
It won't, and we saw reporting around some retaliation over the Chagos deal around that. I mean, there is obviously a domestic political factor here. We just saw Labour get absolutely trounced in Gorton and Denton, partly over its support for Israel's war in Gaza. So, I think Labour's quite conscious of how this war might play. But I also think the likes of Richard Herman, the Attorney General, and Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, are understandably a bit cautious about what is the legal basis and, in fact, what is the strategic rationale here, because regime change is what's been put on the table. But, that is a pretty big demand, and frankly quite hard to implement.
Well, let's move away from World War III for a moment to a far more important issue, which is Gorton and Denton. What did you take from it, Josh? What did you take from the result?
Well, I think that it was in some ways a disappointing night for reform, because I do think that if you go back 6 months, there was this sense that, there was a sort of inevitability of reform. I remember being at their conference in September, and there was this sense that, we're the natural party, we're the next party of government. And, even last week, Nigel Farage was appointing his shadow cabinet, even though there's only about 7 MPs. So I think Gorton and Denton did provide a bit of a check on that ambition. They still did quite well, considering where they're a new party. They still got 29% in a very ethnically diverse constituency where you wouldn't expect them necessarily to win.
It's not quite a red wall seat, is it? Because of that 30%.
It's a funny mix of a seat. It's a hybrid seat, but still, it does show that there is perhaps a bit of a plateau and a ceiling, to mix my metaphors, on Reform's ambitions. I still think they'll do well in May. I still think they'll pick up lots of seats in the Midlands, outer boroughs of London. I still think that it's not a disaster for them by any means, but I do think that maybe some of the euphoria or has slightly gone out in terms of it's going to be a long journey, and the end point is not necessarily number 10.
Well, fairly senior bloke who works for Reform, I put this to him this morning, that it wasn't a great result. He said 436 on our hit list, which is probably true. But it's also true what you say, that there's kind of West-East divide with the Reform vote, isn't there? That it tends to do far, far better on the Eastern Seaboard and the East Midlands and the North East and so on, rather than in the more traditionally Labour strongholds of Manchester, Liverpool and so on.
Yeah, the political scientist Ben Ansell has described the Reform vote as based around the Danelaw, which
yes,
is...
that's right. That's it exactly, isn't it? Yes.
Which is, I like it as a deep cut.
Yes.
But there is possibly something to that in terms of the ethnic and political makeup of the country.
It's funny because I was talking to a number of Reform people who, before the vote was actually announced, but clearly clearly they had expected to win that seat and were not going to win that seat. And there were various reasons put down. So one of them was blaming the candidate, Matt Goodwin, because everyone else was very local and working class and so on. When Matt, who claims a locality there from his family, but is basically a Southern academic, isn't he? But that didn't seem to do it for me. There were complaints about the importation of various Tory deadbeats into the party, of which Nadeem Zahawi was frequently mentioned. And you look at the polls, and yes, Reform is still out in front, but the latest poll from YouGov has them on 24% rather than 29-30, which it had been on. It has been a gradual slide, I think, the last 3 or 4
Yeah,
months.
I mean, I think maybe plateau rather than slide, but yes, and I think that, I mean, I did some focus groups up in Gorton and Denton a couple of weeks ago. I sat in on them, and both those points you made came up. That Matt Goodwin was a Southerner, it was perceived as such, and that but fundamentally, I think people are voting on Farage still when they look at Reform,
Yes.
and I think that what they've maybe underestimated is their unpopularity.
Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah.
And that while, yes, there is a third of the country that is Reform or Reform curious, there is more than a third of the country that bloody hates them.
And that will vote for anyone.
And will coalesce, as
Yeah.
they did in Caerphilly, and as they now did in Gorton and Denton, around the best way to beat them.
Yeah.
Electorates can be quite savvy like that, and both times in a by-election, we've seen that the electorate has found a way to beat Reform.
Well, they can do that in a by-election. Far harder to do that, perhaps, in a general election, isn't it? Where there's far less focus on one particular seat, and it's far harder for the electorate to say, well, that's definitely Plaid that's going to win that, or that's definitely the Greens who are going to win that. It's a more difficult thing to
It
do,
is, and in a general election, you are also thinking about, well, who do I actually want to be the Prime Minister? You know, lots of people vote nationally in a general election, not just saying in their constituency. So, yeah, I mean, it'll look very different, but it does show that, and I think Reform will be, their strategists will be thinking, and Farage will be thinking now, okay, what is this telling us, and how do we? Previously they thought their ceiling was about 40%.
Yes.
That's now looking quite distant.
It is, isn't it?
So is that still in play, or do they need to rethink and re-strategise?
And the other thing, I suppose we ought to mention this because I mention it every week doing this programme, that the result could see the end of Sir Keir Starmer. I have lost count now of the number of times I've been saying, could this be the end of Keir Starmer? It never seems to me that it is.
No, I mean, clearly it weakens him further, but the fundamentals of who is actually going to challenge him and how are they going to unite the party behind them, and how are they going to oust this quite stubborn Prime Minister remain true. Yeah. He doesn't want to go. He wants to be given the time to show that his kind of master plan for Britain is working. He knows he's radically unpopular, but he just thinks that sort of comes with the territory of being Prime Minister.
It kind of does as well.
It does. I mean, he's the last 4 Prime Ministers. I think you've written this. Yeah. I've read you on this, but you're completely right. And there is that sort of, the mood of the public is savage and febrile and impatient. And he says, look, you just got to give me the time. But I do think that, if they do really get swept across the board in May, and it's hard to look at the picture in May's elections and see where Labour does well. That Wales is gone, Scotland's a mess, the Midlands and will go Reform.
Yeah.
So they're going to get, and the Greens clearly are going to do well in inner London and places like that. So they're going to have a really rough time in May. So it may be that by then the sort of tectonic plates of the Labour Party have shifted enough that an Angela Rayner or someone else can come forward, or if they can get Burnham a seat. I think Burnham's the one, isn't it? Real threat.
Yeah.
And I think Starmer knows that because, he's the one that doesn't have the baggage so much. So if he can get into Parliament, it's an interesting hypothetical now, but if a seat came up for Burnham, would Starmer still have the political strength to block him and the rationale to block him? And if not, I think that could be the chink in his armour. And
just finally, I'd really love to be at it, but the meeting, which has got to be arranged between Zach Polanski and the Muslim voters in Gorton and Denton when he explains to them their policies on transgenderism, women's rights, gay rights, and indeed the legalisation of drugs.
Yeah, that coalition clearly is ideologically unstable, you would think. I think Gaza unites it, though.
Gaza, I was told by a reform guy that Gaza made everything else irrelevant.
I think that's right. I think it's such a deeply held conviction for people on both sides of the Green Coalition that it does act as a glue, but indefinitely, it probably won't. So there clearly are some fragilities in that coalition.
Yes, that's very well nicely put, Josh, if I may say so. And that's Josh Glancy, the wonderful Josh Glancy, Sunday Times associate editor and political columnist. Read more from him in the paper tomorrow or with a digital subscription at thetimes.com.